Lecture 9, Culture and Diversity. Recall this picture from our first lecture, the first night of class. When you first saw this picture and the words, "Tell me about this picture," left my mouth, what was the first thought that popped into your head? Well, clearly we have a classic example of organizational behavior management here. No, maybe not. Eventually we did uncover many points regarding organizational behavior management. We uncovered delineation of roles and distribution of labor. We discovered specialization and training. We saw tactical and strategic planning and organization. We saw rituals and a common purpose leading toward achieving a common goal, complete with stories and sagas that will be told as organizational lore. We saw all of this once we got past our first impression, which was, be honest here, a bunch of savages killing an elephant. In fact, I think one of the first comments from the class was right along those lines. Our first impression was based upon our preconceived notions, our biases. We've hit bias a couple of times already throughout these lectures, and if memory serves, I mentioned the first night in class that I'd be hitting them again later when we got to culture and diversity. This lecture is going to focus again on bias, and it's a hot topic right now, a bias known as implicit bias. We'll get to that in a bit, but with all of these biases we've discussed, each one contributes to the nasty little corner of our inverted pyramid that we've seen many times before. When we start making decisions based on assumptions, rather than working from our values and basing our decisions on facts, we are confined to live and relive the quote from Travis here. Chapter 13 in our book does a credible job of classical organizational behavior management and their outlook for diversity and culture. And your homework will also be classically focused. But as usual, I want to add a bit more to this topic. Page 471 in our book outlines the 3 phases of success for a diverse team: awareness, understanding, and action. This is a formula that I will follow for this lecture. First will be to help you become aware of implicit bias. Second, to gain understanding of it. And then third, hopefully provide actionable steps to reduce and maybe even eliminate, as best we can, implicit bias. All right, so here we go. The first phase is awareness. What do you see in this picture? What comes to mind when you see this picture? Intellectually, we know something's up here, right? Because the prof's asking the question. And well, if this were 1950, no one probably asked such a question. Not even me. But it ain't 1950. So now we ask such questions. What's sort of astonishing to me is it took like a minute of worth of web crawling to find an all-white guy board of directors. I figured that would be a thing of the past. Nope. So, how diverse do you think their thought patterns are? What sort of cultural decisions do you think this leadership team makes? For that matter, how fair am I being with my preconceived notions and bias regarding this leadership team? They're probably a great group of guys, right? What I can say for a fact about this team is this: it is not culturally diverse. They are most likely from the same tribe, the rich white guy tribe. Look, I've discussed numerous times that top management models and sets the tone for companies. I'd like you to take a moment and turn to page 468 in our book. And I'll give you a moment, so hit pause, get your book, and turn to page 468. So read with me at the bottom of the page. It starts, "It is critical that the most senior managers live and breathe inclusiveness. Otherwise, all other efforts may be weakened or wasted. When top-level executives emulate corporate culture, it's easier for employees to follow and commit to adopting inclusive culture themselves." Now think for a moment. How inclusive is the group of leaders in this company? Really? Okay, I'm about to show you another picture, and once it comes up, please consider your very first emotional response. Okay, here it goes. So, how about this leadership team from NorCal? What do you see in this picture? What comes to mind? How are you feeling about this team? Might they have a more diverse and inclusive set of views? Here are 3 individuals. Consider these 3 and where you might place them in life. All right? Now check this out. Now that you've seen the next picture, were you surprised? Here's 3 individuals. Consider these 3 and where you might place them in life. Okay, let me show you this. Now that you've seen the next picture, did you say to yourself, makes sense? The 2 preceding slides were taken from Bayard Roth Smith's Our Kind of People. What I find fascinating is that each person was able to maintain exactly the same neutral facial expression for each and every portrait. Only the attire changed. Now, let's review a paper from Charles Ebersole and Brian Nosek, and they're both of the University of Virginia, and their article, Research Reveals Pervasive Implicit Hierarchies for Race, Religion, and Age. It was published in Psychological Science, a journal of the Association for Psychological Science in July 2014. Charles and Brian's paper analyzed data from hundreds of thousands of participants who completed an online implicit association test on race, religion, and age. Participants of the test viewed male or female faces of a particular racial group, as well as positive words such as love, pleasant, great, and wonderful, and negative words such as hate, unpleasant, awful, and terrible. For each set of faces, participants categorized the positive and negative words with faces belonging to each racial group. The idea behind the implicit association test is that people are quicker to respond to and categorize 2 things together with a response when they are associated more closely in memory, even if they consciously reject that association. So, if a person has positive associations with a particular racial group, it took less time to categorize faces from that group together with positive words. Conversely, a person with negative associations needed more time to categorize faces from that group together with positive words. Thus, the implicit association test uncovered biases people were not conscious of and did not endorse. Now, it's very important to note that implicit racial bias is not the same thing as conscious explicit racism or other explicit forms of bias. People who harbor implicit biases may not think of themselves as prejudiced, and in fact, may consider prejudice to be abhorrent. They may also not even know they have these biases. And that is precisely the reason for increasing our awareness of implicit racial bias. The paper found that participants were most likely to prefer members of their own race. Additionally, though, members of almost every racial group exhibited an implicit racial hierarchy of positive evaluations. White, then Asian, then Black, and then Hispanic, in that order. The researchers offer an explanation for the results. And they say our explicit conscious attitudes may be derived more from personal beliefs about others, but at the same time, these implicit attitudes may arise both from our own identities as well as from widely spread cultural beliefs and values. While we may disagree with such cultural beliefs, these results illustrate how they can nevertheless shape our minds. So what about our assumptions regarding gender? Now, Jennifer Raymond is an associate professor of neurobiology and an associate dean in the Office of Diversity and Leadership at the Stanford University School of Medicine. And she said the following. She says, I have a bias against women in science. And please don't hold this against me. I am a woman scientist, mentor, and advocate for women in science, and an associate dean in my school's Office of Diversity, with a budding field biologist as a daughter. Yet my performance on the implicit association test, and that's the same test we just talked about last slide, revealed that I have a tendency to associate men with science and career and women with liberal arts and family. I didn't even need to wait for my score. She said I could feel my responses were slower, and I made more mistakes when I had to group science words, such as astronomy, with female words, such as wife, rather than male words, such as uncle. The results from hundreds of thousands of people indicate I am not an outlier. 70% of men and women across 34 countries view science as more male than female. So it's an astonishing result, right? We are not immune, even if we belong to a group that feels disenfranchised by implicit bias. So how about our assumptions regarding religion? The Washington Post reports the U.S. Department of Education announced it will be collecting data this year about allegations of discrimination or bullying of students based on their religion, bringing new attention to what educators and advocates call a growing problem in public schools, particularly for Muslim students. Well, the Washington Post continues that the impact of the terrorist attacks in Paris, San Bernardino, and Orlando by individuals who claimed allegiance to the Islamic State, and a presidential candidate who has proposed a ban on Muslims entering the country have fueled a wave of anti-Muslim sentiment. The headlines and rhetoric on the campaign trail are seeping into school lunchrooms and hallways, and they're being felt by Muslim children. Muslim students report being called everything from a terrorist to jokes about where's your bomb. One survey in California found in 2014 that over half of the American Muslim students in those schools reported some form of bullying based upon their religious identity while at school. National Public Radio, in their September 28th morning edition report, Bias Isn't Just a Police Problem, It's a Preschool Problem, reports that even the most well-meaning teacher can harbor deep-seated biases, whether she or he knows it or not. It is these subtle, often subconscious stereotypes that guide our expectations and interactions with people. These biases, and we'll talk more about those in a bit, are a natural process by which we take information and we judge people on the basis of generalizations regarding that information. We all do it. Race, gender, religion? How about age? So Robert Neil Butler wrote a paper in 1969 in The Gerontologist. It was entitled Ageism, Another Form of Bigotry. And he coined the term ageism and defined it as stereotyping and discriminating against individuals or groups on the basis of their age. His paper dealt with discrimination against seniors and stated it was patterned on sexism and racism. He defined ageism as a combination of three connected elements. First, among them were prejudicial attitudes towards older people, old age, and the aging process. Secondly, discriminatory practices against older people. And third, institutional practices and policies that perpetuate stereotypes about elderly people. So, let's take a peek into the lunchroom here at this retirement community. Looks common and average enough, right? I'm sure we have preconceived notions about the folks we see in this picture. And now, let me tell you a story about one of the folks seated in this picture. Don Jandernoa graduated from high school in 1941 and enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1942. He attained the rank of first lieutenant and proudly served his country as a pilot and a commander of a B-24 Liberator bomber with the 454th Bombardment Group, 15th Air Force. He participated in the European theater and flew 23 missions. On January 31, 1945, Don and his crew had to bail out of their damaged plane, and Don landed in the 43-degree Adriatic Sea near the Isle of Var. Just before drowning, he was miraculously rescued by a fisherman who pulled him aboard his boat. Now, Don was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the European Theater Ribbon, the Air Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters. Okay? Commander of a B-24 Liberator, 23 missions over Europe. He did all of this by the age of 21. Now, let's take a look at our 20-something skateboarders here. You see, the term ageism has also been used to describe prejudice and discrimination against young adults, adolescents, and children, including ignoring their ideas because they are too young or assuming they should behave in certain ways because of their age. These biases and stereotypes swing both ways. Okay, we now move from awareness to understanding. Okay, quick review. Cognitive biases, right? Inferences about other people and situations that may be drawn in an illogical fashion, and then individuals create their own subjective social reality from their perception. Then we covered availability bias. They were mental shortcuts that relied on immediate examples that came to mind when we were evaluating a decision. We talked about fearing a swim in the ocean because of sharks, or fearing a plane trip because planes fall and go boom. Or representation bias, another bias we talked about. Judging a book by its cover, or a person by their appearance. Recall our comparison between William Chevreul, who in this portrait looks a little bit like a homeless vagabond, but in fact has the Hall of Mathematics of the U.S. Naval Academy named after him, as well as a crater on the moon, apart from the other guy that actually is a homeless vagabond. So let's define implicit bias. And the Kirwan Institute at The Ohio State University is going to help us do this. They begin by describing implicit bias as attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. I'm going to say that again. Implicit bias are our attitudes or our stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases, which encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments, happen involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. These biases reside deep in our subconscious and are different from known biases that individuals may choose to conceal for purposes of social or political correctness. Rather, implicit biases are not accessible through introspection. The implicit associations we harbor in our subconscious cause us to have feelings and attitudes about other people based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, age, gender, and appearance. These associations develop over the course of a lifetime, beginning at a very early age through exposure to direct and indirect messages. In addition to early life experiences, the media and news programming are often cited origins of implicit associations. So now they go on to cite a 2012 study to examine how pediatricians' implicit racial attitudes affected the treatment recommendations for 4 common pediatric conditions. The results revealed that as pediatricians' pro-white implicit biases increased, they were more likely to prescribe painkillers for their patients who were white as opposed to black. This is one example of understanding how implicit racial biases may help explain differential healthcare treatment, even for children. Now, a few key characteristics of implicit bias. Implicit biases are pervasive. Everyone possesses them, even people with avowed commitments to impartiality, like judges. Implicit and explicit biases are related, but they're distinct, and they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, they may even reinforce each other. The implicit associations we do hold do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs, or even reflect stances we would explicitly endorse. And we generally tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own group, though research has shown that we can still hold implicit biases against our group, as was our example from Professor Jennifer Raymond and her gender bias experience. The Kirwan Institute at OSU summarizes that as convincing research evidence accumulates, it becomes difficult to understate the importance of considering the role of implicit bias when analyzing social inequities. But there's hope, and that hope resides on the last point of our page here. Implicit biases are malleable, which means they are not cast in stone. Look, our brains are incredibly complex, and the implicit associations that we have formed can be gradually unlearned through a variety of techniques and habits. So now we move from understanding to action. Linda Tropp and Rachel Godsell published a paper in Psychology Today, and the paper is entitled Overcoming Implicit Bias and Racial Anxiety. Fighting subconscious bias takes effort, but it can be done. That was published in January 2015. They reveal that social scientists seeking to address the effects of racial bias look to two broad categories of intervention. First, efforts to reduce bias, and second, efforts to mitigate the effects of any remaining bias. Now, simply making people aware that they have the potential to be biased is not enough. They say people require specific and tailored forms of intervention. They list some examples. They say exposing people to counter-stereotypic examples of a group member. So in one experiment, people showed measurably less implicit bias toward Asian Americans after they watched The Joy-Luck Club, a movie about Asian immigrants in the U.S. Consciously contrasting negative stereotypes with specific counterexamples. So for example, suppose you hear or think of a negative stereotype about African Americans. You can compare that stereotype to what you know about a friend or a famous person such as Oprah Winfrey or President Obama. Rather than aim to be colorblind, the goal should be to individuate, which means to think of somebody as a person. By seeking specific information about members of other racial groups, right, this individuation allows you to recognize people based upon their own personal attributes rather than stereotypes about their racial or ethnic group. And this goes to empathy, or the idea of walking a mile in someone else's shoes. Another tactic is to assume the perspective of someone who is different from you. Gender, racial, age, weight. Ask yourself what your perspective might be if you were in another person's situation. You can begin to develop a better appreciation for what their concerns are. So by way of example, if you were to phrase the words that just left your mouth differently, if a person from a particular group was standing there, then you are probably reinforcing bias and stereotypes. Simply choose not to do this. Lead by example. And remember, leadership is all about change, and the first person who has to change is the leader. Or make more of an effort to encounter and engage in a positive interaction with members of other racial and ethnic groups. Simply put, the more time spent enjoying the company of members of other racial ethnic groups, the more that racial anxiety and stereotyping will begin to dissipate. So Linda Tropp and Rachel Godsell go on to say that perhaps not surprisingly, one of the best ways of reducing racial anxiety is by having friends or colleagues of another racial group. But mere contact between group members isn't enough. What's important is meaningful, ongoing relations. Now, places where members of different racial groups interact cooperatively and meet as equals, such as on a sports team or in the military, they are particularly good at breaking down implicit racism. Trust and rapport between racial groups are harder to build in racially homogeneous environments. Recall our Black Rock leadership team at the beginning of this lecture. Right? All of us who share an underlying belief in political and social equality should try to become more aware of and hopefully overcome our own biases. But it's particularly important for institutions to watch out for ways in which these biases play out, right? Many of the most important decisions affecting individuals' lives take place within our schools, our hospitals, our companies. It's within these environments that many of the inequalities that still trouble us as a nation continue to persevere. Yet it can be difficult to spot, especially instances of racism because of the different number of variables at work in any given individual situation. Now, using larger data to demonstrate the prevalence of racially based decision-making is often more effective than trying to demonstrate bias on a case-by-case basis. This is why experiments like the implicit association test we talked about earlier are so key. So now, I will end this lecture with a quote from Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Well, it's happened again. You've reached the end of another lecture, Lecture 9, Culture and Diversity. And now here is our Lecture 9 Call to Action. There are 3 phases of success for a diverse team: awareness, understanding, and action. We all have implicit biases, even at times to the detriment of our own group. These implicit biases we have are not something we can just shut down or correct by force of logic. However, our implicit bias is malleable, which means we can change it if we choose to. There are steps we can take to, bit by bit, piece by piece, change how we view others. One of the best ways of reducing implicit bias is by having friends or colleagues of another group. It's up to us to make that happen. As with any change, leadership is all about change, and the first person who has to change and accept that change is the leader.